The courtroom was quiet. Too quiet. You could hear the ticking of the old clock on the wall like it was marking the seconds of someone's life. Judge Ava Coleman sat at the bench, her black robe crisp, her posture steady, but her fingers lightly tapped the gavel in front of her, not out of impatience, out of restraint. A storm was brewing under that calm exterior. The door creaked open. The defendant shuffled into the room, wrists in cuffs, eyes darting, but still holding on to something he probably thought was pride. John Blake. The name hit her like a cold slap, even though she'd known this moment was coming for weeks. The same man who nearly 2 decades ago dragged her into a courtroom, humiliated her in front of strangers, and did something no one had ever been held accountable for. He'd shaved her head, in court, while she sobbed and pleaded. And now, he was the one in shackles. "You may be seated," Ava said, her voice unwavering. Inside, her heart pounded. She wasn't 17 anymore. She wasn't powerless. She was the judge. The irony wasn't lost on her. This courtroom, where she'd once been treated like a criminal without a voice, was now her domain. And the man who stole her dignity was about to have his fate decided by her. But no one in the room knew. Not the bailiff, not the prosecutor, not the quiet court reporter typing every word, only her and him, their eyes locked. For a brief second his pupils widened. Recognition, maybe even fear. But he quickly masked it with a smug smile, the same one he wore the day he shaved her head and called it justice. Ava leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Blake, you stand accused of abuse of power, unlawful use of force, and civil rights violations. You have the right to remain silent, but for once in your life I hope you choose to listen." He blinked. She saw the slightest tremble in his hands. Good. Outside the courthouse, protests were growing louder. The city had seen enough of these cases, where officers like Blake walked free. But this case was different. Not because of the evidence, because of who was holding the gavel. For Ava, this wasn't revenge, this was justice, and it was just beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Before the robe, before the title, before the courtroom, there was just Ava, a skinny black girl from Zone 3, Atlanta, raised on powdered milk and second-hand dreams. Her mother, Angela, was a night shift nurse at Grady Hospital. Her father, Marvin, was a mechanic who smiled more with his eyes than his lips, until the day he stopped smiling altogether. They said he stole a stereo. Just a stereo. No weapon, no threat. Just a false accusation and a rushed trial. 2 years later, Marvin Coleman died of a stroke behind bars at 43. No apology, no reparation, just a folded flag and an overgrown grave. Ava was only 10. That's when she started paying attention. To the looks, to the whispers in the halls, to how her mother came home with bruises under her eyes, not from fists but from exhaustion and hopelessness. They told Ava she was too loud, too angry, too smart for her own good. So she tried to shrink herself, wore her hair straight, kept her hands folded in class, memorized the Pledge of Allegiance like it might save her one day. It didn't. When she was 17, she walked into a corner store on her way home from school. A white woman screamed that her wallet was missing. No evidence, no surveillance. Just Ava in the wrong place with the wrong skin. Officer John Blake arrived within minutes. She remembered his voice, slow, southern, and soaked in sarcasm. "Well, look what we got here. You want to be treated like an adult, sweetheart? Fine. Let's do this in court." Ava was shoved into the back of a cruiser, booked, processed, and thrown into a detention cell. But the worst part hadn't even happened yet. The day of the hearing, she walked into the courtroom, wearing an orange jumpsuit 2 sizes too big. Her curls, thick and proud, had always been her favorite thing. Not for long. Blake claimed her hair could be used to hide contraband, called it a security risk, and with no lawyer, no one to fight for her, no mother in the room because of a hospital emergency, they let him do it. He buzzed it all off, right there. While she cried in front of strangers, her dignity hit the floor in strands. She walked out of that courtroom bald, broken and bleeding inside. For weeks, Ava refused to leave her room. Mirrors were the enemy. Silence was too loud. Her mother tried everything, but she couldn't understand the kind of wound that wasn't visible. One night, Ava found her father's old notebook in the closet. Inside were sketches of engines, half-written, prayers and a single quote circled in red ink. "The system doesn't change from the outside. You gotta get in the driver's seat." That's when something shifted. A few days later, she walked into her school counselor's office and asked for help getting into a pre-law mentorship. The counselor looked surprised, then impressed, and so began Ava's quiet rebellion. One textbook at a time. She didn't forget what they did, but she started building the tools to make sure it would never happen again. Not to her, not to anyone. The case against Ava was dropped a week later. No evidence, no apology, just a quiet note from the public defender's office. Charges dismissed. But by then the damage had been done. In her neighborhood, your name was everything. And once the streets whispered that you'd been arrested, that you'd been humiliated in a courtroom, well, there was no going back to who you were before. Kids she used to study with now crossed the hall when they saw her coming. Some laughed, some looked at her with pity. One boy said she looked like a crackhead G.I. Jane. Even the teachers, the ones who had once praised her straight A's, suddenly seemed colder. Like the word trouble had been tattooed on her forehead, invisible to her but glowing red in their eyes. The real sentence hadn't come from the court. It came from the world. Ava kept her head down. Literally, she wore hoodies even when it was hot. She avoided mirrors. She skipped yearbook photos. Her mum tried to cheer her up, suggesting wigs or headscarves, but Ava refused. If they were going to mark her as different, she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. The worst part, John Blake was still out there, still patrolling, still smiling in his smug little way, still hailed as a tough-on-crime officer in the local papers. He even won a community service award 3 months later. The photo showed him shaking hands with a judge, the same one who allowed her hair to be shaved without blinking. But the fire inside Ava didn't die. It simmered, every slight, every stare. Every time someone crossed the street to avoid her, or locked their car door when she walked by, she remembered, and she worked. She started reading case law like it was scripture. She spent hours in the public library poring over civil rights decisions, memorizing Supreme Court rulings, and writing essays so sharp her English teacher accused her of plagiarism. Until Ava recited it back to her, line for line, no notes. Her mother noticed the change. Fewer tears, more grit. Less talking, more doing. One night, while cooking dinner, Angela looked over and said softly, "You know, baby, if your daddy could see you now, he'd be proud as hell." Ava didn't say anything, but she smiled for the first time in weeks. She joined a mentorship program for high school girls of color interested in law. Her mentor, Ms. Denise Hargrove, was a former public defender who didn't sugarcoat anything. "They're not going to give you a seat at the table, Ava," Denise said. "You're going to have to build your own damn table and bring your own chair." That stuck. So she kept building. By the time she graduated, Ava had a full scholarship to Spelman. Her essay titled "The Trial That Never Ended," about what it means to grow up being judged for existing, and how she planned to fight from the inside out. No one clapped louder at her graduation than her mother. No one cried harder either. But even on that stage, cap and gown, diploma in hand, Ava knew her trial wasn't over. It had only just begun. The campus at Spelman College felt like stepping into sunlight after years of fog. Red brick buildings, lush magnolia trees, the air buzzing with voices, ideas, resistance, black women walking with their heads high, curls wild, braids bold, confidence stitched into every step. It was nothing like high school. But for Ava, confidence didn't come. Easy, not yet. Every time she passed a mirror, she still expected to see that girl, eyes swollen, scalp raw, spirit cracked. She wore her hair cropped close now, not from shame, but from control. Her curls would grow when she was ready. For now, this was her armor. The first semester hit like a freight train. Philosophy 101, Intro to Law, Political Theory, sleep-deprived nights and coffee-stained notebooks. But Ava thrived in the chaos. She didn't party, didn't date. While other students posted selfies and sorority pledges, she studied Supreme Court decisions and memorized the Constitution. Like it was her love language, her professors noticed, especially Dr. Rhodes, an icy but brilliant legal studies professor who'd clerked for the federal court. "You're not just smart," he told her one day after class. "You're dangerous. That's a good thing. But the past has a funny way of whispering even when it's silent." One evening, during a debate on criminal justice reform, another student, well-meaning, privileged, clueless, said, "Well, if you don't break the law, you won't have problems with police." Ava's pen snapped in half. She didn't yell. She didn't storm out. She leaned forward, voice calm but sharp enough to slice bone. "Tell that to my father. He died in prison for something he didn't do. Tell it to my 17-year-old self who got her head shaved in court because someone assumed I looked like a thief." The room went still. The professor didn't interrupt. No one did. And in that silence, Ava realized something. She wasn't the same girl anymore. She wasn't just surviving. She was starting to own the space. That winter, she applied for an internship at the Georgia Innocence Project. She spent hours in filing rooms reading through cold cases, listening to mothers who hadn't hugged their sons in 20 years, watching men break down when DNA evidence finally cleared their names. It fueled her, but it also gutted her. Every exoneration felt like justice delayed. Every story reminded her of her father, of what could have been, of what should have been. Sometimes she cried in the bathroom between case reviews. But she never quit. By junior year, she was known around campus, not for being the loudest, for being the most relentless. She was invited to speak at a criminal justice panel alongside law professors and activists. She wore a tailored blazer and no makeup, her voice steady, her story raw. "I'm not a lawyer yet," she said, "but I've lived in a courtroom longer than most attorneys, and I've learned something. The system is not broken. It's doing exactly what it was built to do, but we're here to rebuild it." The audience gave her a standing ovation. One professor pulled her aside afterward. "You ever think about becoming a judge?" Ava smiled but didn't answer. Not yet. Later that night, walking back to her dorm alone, she paused under a street lamp. The glow hit her just right, and for a split second, she saw her reflection in a window. Short hair. Strong jaw. Fierce eyes, not ashes anymore, just armor. Harvard law wasn't just a dream, it was war. Not because of the reading load, though it was brutal, or the Socratic method, which she actually liked. No. Ava felt the war in the silence after she spoke in class, in the way some white students flinched when she brought up race or stopped meeting her eyes altogether. Here she wasn't poor. She wasn't invisible. She was a threat, a 5'6". Black woman who spoke with purpose and precision and never smiled when she didn't feel like it. Still, she rose. Top 10% of her class. Law review. Clerkship interviews, before most people had. Picked their second-year electives, but none of that prepared her for Kenny. He was 19. Locked up in a juvenile detention center in Roxbury. Arrested for armed robbery. The public defender's office had thrown the case to a new intern. Her, Ava read the file twice. The store owner couldn't identify him clearly. No gun was recovered. Surveillance footage was grainy at best. But Kenny had a record, minor stuff, mostly truancy and petty theft. The system didn't care. When she met him, he was quiet. Slouched. His hands barely left his hoodie pocket. "You think I did it?" he asked after 10 minutes of silence. Ava shook her head. "I think you've been through hell. And I think that's the first thing they saw when you walked into court." Kenny smiled a little, just a flicker. "You talk like you've been there." She nodded. "I have." Ava worked that case like it was personal, dug through evidence, tracked down witnesses, found holes in the police timeline. She even got the store owner to admit that he couldn't say for sure who the suspect was. But the DA pushed for a plea deal anyway. 5 years. Better than 10, they said. Ava begged him not to take. "Let me fight. Let me put this in front of a jury." Kenny shook his head. "You a law student, not God. They ain't listening to you. Or me." He took the deal. And that night, Ava went home, sat on the floor of her apartment, and sobbed for the first time in months. Somewhere deep down, she had believed that being smart, being right, being relentless would be enough. But the system wasn't made to hear voices like hers, or Kenny's, and the truth was brutal. Some people you just can't save. A week later, she visited him before his transfer to a state facility. He sat behind glass, orange jumpsuit, swallowing his frame. "I didn't think you'd come," he said. "I had to," she replied, "to tell you I'm not done." "With me? With any of it?" He nodded. "Good. Somebody got to make this thing bleed." Ava stared at him, heart burning. "I'm not here to make it bleed. I'm here to make it answer for itself." After that case, something hardened in her, not cold, just focused. She chose her electives differently. Focused on constitutional law, civil rights litigation, police accountability. Her thesis was titled, "Justice on Trial, When the System Prosecutes Itself." She turned it in on the anniversary of the day she was arrested at 17. Some people become lawyers for the prestige, some for the money. Ava? She became one for the ghosts, and they followed her everywhere. By the time Ava made it to her second year at Harvard Law, she had already earned a reputation: quiet, intense, brilliant. But there was him, James Matthews, who seemed to shine in every room he entered, tall, dark, with a smile that was too perfect, as though it had been designed specifically to charm. His deep voice made everyone stop and listen, even when his words weren't particularly remarkable. But it wasn't his charm that caught Ava's attention. It was his work and his drive. Matthews was also one of the top students, a legacy student, and the son of a prominent judge in Boston. He wrote about police reform, often argued against the very same system that had failed her father, and Ava knew exactly who he was, and she wasn't interested. But life and the universe have a funny way of breaking down walls, especially when you least expect it. One day she was assigned as his research partner for a joint project in one of their most challenging courses, Criminal Justice and Ethics. At first, Ava resisted. She wasn't in the mood to play nice with someone who could easily become another obstacle. Besides, what did he know about injustice? What did he know about being crushed by the system? But James surprised her. During their first meeting in the library, he didn't try to impress her with credentials or connections. Instead, he asked her questions, real questions, about her past, about the injustices she'd seen, about how the law was supposed to make things right when it often didn't. "I can't even imagine what it's like to fight against something that's supposed to protect you," he admitted quietly. "But I want to help. I need to understand." His honesty was raw, almost too raw for her to trust. "Just because you can understand doesn't mean you'll fix it," she replied, her voice tinged with the bitterness that still lived inside her. "You need more than words. You need the weight of what's at stake, and sometimes that weight is heavier than anyone can bear." They worked together late into the night, sometimes talking more about their personal lives than the project. James told her about his father, Judge Charles Matthews, a man with a reputation for fairness and strength, but also known for his political connections. James was expected to follow in his father's footsteps, to wear the mantle of justice like an iron crown. But he didn't want it. He wanted to create justice, not uphold a system that was already broken. "I never felt like I was my own person," James confessed as they sat together in the library, papers scattered around them. "My father was everything I was supposed to be. And now everyone expects me to take over. It's like I'm still a kid in his shadow, trying to figure out who I am." Ava looked at him, her heart pulling in directions she didn't expect. "You'll never get out of his shadow, James. If you want to make real change, you're going to have to walk through it and leave it behind," she said, her voice steady, but with a hint of emotion she couldn't quite conceal. She knew that shadow all too well. As the semester wore on, their relationship shifted. Ava couldn't deny that James had earned her respect. His passion for justice wasn't just a cause, it was personal. They began discussing cases late into the night. They argued, they disagreed. But in the end, they made each other better. But still, she couldn't fully trust him. Not yet. He was too polished, too much like the men in suits who had called her father a criminal, like the ones who'd turned a blind eye to what had happened to her. Then came the moment when it all began to change. They were sitting in his apartment one evening, reviewing their case study for the final project. The conversation had drifted from law to personal life, inevitable really after weeks of late-night sessions. James had just poured them both some wine when he casually asked, "Do you ever think about the past? About what happened to you back in Atlanta?" Ava froze. He didn't wait for her answer. Wait for her. Instead, he spoke gently, his voice almost a whisper. "I can't imagine what you went through, but I respect you for it. You're stronger than anyone I know, and I know you're going to change this system for the better." Ava's chest tightened. Her past was something she rarely let people into, not fully, but here he was, sitting on the other side of her, seeing her, really seeing her. She looked away, taking a deep breath. "I've been through a lot," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's never been about me, it's about the fight for everyone who doesn't have a voice." James nodded, but there was a sadness in his eyes that Ava wasn't sure how to read. That night, as she lay in her bed, she realized something she hadn't expected. She wanted to trust him. She didn't want to carry her anger alone anymore. But trusting him was dangerous. The line between trust and betrayal is a tightrope, and Ava felt like she was walking it every time she was around James. She hadn't expected to become close to him, let alone open up. But there she was, sitting on the edge of his couch, sharing stories of her childhood, her family, her scars, things she had buried deep inside for years. The more she told him, the more she realized just how much she had been holding back. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like the weight was lifting. But every moment she spent with him made her feel more conflicted. Because deep down, she knew something she couldn't deny. She was falling for him. It was the first time in years she had allowed herself to feel anything other than anger and determination. James was kind, caring. He didn't see her as the product of a broken system, but as a woman with a future, as someone capable of more than just surviving. But with every passing day, Ava couldn't shake the nagging thought at the back of her mind. What if he's just like everyone else? What if he was just another well-meaning person who would ultimately fail her? What if, after everything, he was part of the very system she was trying to tear down? Her father's shadow still loomed large, and with it, the idea that people like James, people born into power, born into privilege, could never truly understand the fight. The turning point came a week before their final project was due. James had invited her to dinner, a rare opportunity to escape the confines of the library and their usual late-night study sessions. Ava hesitated but agreed. They sat at a small table in a quiet corner of a local bistro. James had his usual charming smile, but there was something in his eyes that made Ava's heart beat faster. Nervousness, uncertainty. "Are you okay?" he asked, the words carrying a weight that surprised her. Ava looked at him, trying to read his expression. "Yeah," she replied, but the uncertainty was already creeping in. "What was he about to say? I've been thinking," James started, his voice careful. "I know this is all crazy, Harvard, law school, everything, but I don't know. I feel like we've connected in a way I can't ignore. And I don't want you to think that I'm just doing this because it's convenient or because I feel sorry for you. I genuinely care about you, Ava." Ava froze. The words hung in the air, thick with emotion. She didn't know how to respond. She wanted to tell him how she felt, how everything about him made her feel seen for the first time in years, but there was a part of her that pulled back, unwilling to let herself be vulnerable. She began, then stopped. Was this the line she had been so carefully guarding? The line she had never let anyone cross? James looked at her, waiting, and for a long moment Ava's thoughts swirled in chaos. She wanted to believe in him. She wanted to let herself trust again. But everything in her history, the pain, the betrayal, told her not to. "I can't," she finally whispered, the words slipping out like a confession. "I can't trust you, James, not like that. I've been hurt too many times." The look in his eyes was soft but filled with understanding, like he had already known what she was going to say. "I get it," he said quietly. "But I'm not them, Ava. And if you ever decide that you can trust me, if you ever want to open that door, I'll be here." And that was the problem. He would be here. No matter how many times she pushed him away, James Matthews would keep coming back, keep trying to prove that he wasn't like everyone else. The next few weeks were a blur. Ava buried herself in her work, papers, case studies, lectures, anything to keep her mind off of James and what was building between them. But no matter how much she focused on her studies, she couldn't escape the pull he had on her. And the fact that the one thing she needed, closure, seemed just out of reach made it all the harder. The turning point came when she had to make a choice. One of the key cases she had been working on, a civil rights case involving a wrongful death in police custody, was suddenly put in her hands for a final presentation in front of a prestigious judge who had a reputation for being brutal. She knew this case inside and out. It was her chance to prove herself. And yet she couldn't focus. Her thoughts were still consumed by James, by that question that had haunted her for weeks. Can I trust him? The final project was a culmination of everything she had learned in law school so far. The stakes were high not just for her, but for everyone who was counting on her. When she stood in front of the panel of professors, 1,000 thoughts ran through her head. She spoke with power, with authority, outlining every flaw in the case, explaining how the justice system had failed to protect the vulnerable. But in the back of her mind, she kept coming back to James, his words, his smile, his quiet support. When the presentation ended, there was a long pause before the lead professor spoke. Ava, that was exceptional. You've got the sharpest mind in this class, and it shows. But I need to ask you something. Her heart skipped a beat. What was this about? You seem detached, he continued. From the emotion of the case, you know this, you've lived it. So tell me this. What drives you? What's your why? The question hit her like a tidal wave. It wasn't just about law. It wasn't just about being right. It was about what mattered most. Who mattered most? Ava took a deep breath. My why, she said, her voice steady but filled with raw emotion, is for the people who don't have a voice, the ones who are erased, forgotten, and it's about making sure they're never left behind again. The pressure had been building for months, and Ava knew she was close to the edge. The stakes had never been higher. The case she was working on, the one that had been handed to her at the last minute, was a landmark civil rights case. It was a fight against the system she had spent years preparing to challenge. But now, it was personal. Too personal. It had started as a seemingly straightforward wrongful death case involving a black man named Jamar, who had died in police custody. The officers had claimed it was an accident, an unfortunate combination of physical restraint and medical complications. But the autopsy report told a different story. Jamar's death had been the result of excessive force, and the officers had lied about the details of the arrest. Ava had poured everything into this case, determined to bring the truth to light, but she knew the higher-ups had a different agenda. This case was going to test everything she believed about justice. The lead prosecutor on the case, Andrew Harris, was an ambitious, charming man. He had connections, a name, and the right political ties to make this case disappear if he wanted to. Ava knew that Harris was as ruthless as they come, and his position in the courtroom made him the ultimate obstacle. But that didn't scare her. What scared her was that he had a way of pushing the right buttons, her buttons. It all came to a head when they were preparing for their final arguments. Ava had spent hours, days, perfecting every angle of the case. But when she walked into the courthouse, something felt off. The energy was different. The defense team had managed to get a key witness, Officer Carl Beck, the cop who had been involved in the fatal incident, to testify in their favor. Beck was a tall, broad-shouldered man with sharp features, the kind of officer who never backed down from a fight. His testimony was meant to be a game-changer for the defense, casting doubt on the autopsy report and painting Jamar as a violent threat who had been a danger to the officers. Ava knew that if Beck's testimony went uncontested, it could destroy everything. In the courtroom, everything seemed to stand still as Officer Beck took the stand. His eyes scanned the room, never wavering. When he spoke, his voice was deep, confident, controlled. But there was something cold in his gaze, something calculated. Ava watched him closely, her heart racing. She knew the game he was playing. He was trying to manipulate the jury to make them see Jamar as the aggressor. But Ava wasn't about to let that happen. Not on her watch. She stood up, taking a deep breath as she gathered her thoughts. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, "I'd like to call into question the testimony of Officer Beck." Beck's eyes narrowed and the courtroom fell silent. Ava paced slowly in front of the jury, her eyes never leaving Beck. "You claim Jamar was violent, that he resisted arrest. But the reality is, Officer Beck, your testimony is built on lies. Lies designed to protect you and your colleagues, and to cover up what really happened that day." The tension in the room thickened as Ava's words cut through the silence. She knew she was walking a fine line. If she pushed too hard, the defense could use it against her. But if she didn't push, Jamar would never get the justice he deserved. "Officer Beck," she continued, "you weren't just a witness to this tragedy. You were a participant, and you know exactly what happened." Beck's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. The courtroom held its breath, the air thick with the tension of an impending storm. Ava could feel the eyes of the jury on her. She could see the doubt starting to creep into their minds. This was it. And then a voice cut through the silence. "Objection, Your Honor. This is an inappropriate line of questioning," the defense attorney Harris said quickly, trying to regain control of the room. "Overruled," the judge replied, giving Ava the space to continue. She pressed forward, her words sharp and deliberate. "Officer Beck, you want us to believe that your actions were justified, but the reality is you were the one who escalated the situation. You were the one who made a choice that cost a man his life, and now you're sitting here, trying to cover your tracks." Beck's eyes flashed with anger. His hand tightened around the edge of the witness stand, and Ava could see the muscles in his jaw twitch. He was losing his composure, and she knew she had him. But in that moment, something unexpected happened. The defense team threw a curveball, and the courtroom door swung open with force. James Matthews walked in. Ava's heart skipped a beat as she saw him step into the room. He was wearing a sharp suit, his eyes immediately locking with hers. She hadn't expected him to be here, let alone at this pivotal moment. What was he doing here? Why had he come? But as his presence registered, she knew he wasn't here by accident. He had come to stand by her, to back her up when everything was falling apart. The judge raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" James stood tall, unfazed by the sudden attention. "Your Honor," he said calmly, his voice carrying authority, "I'm here as an observer, as a legal scholar. I've been following this case closely, and I believe I can provide valuable insight on the patterns of excessive force used by officers like Beck in these types of situations." Ava's eyes flicked back to Beck, and for the first time she saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. James had done something unexpected. He had backed her into a corner, but he had also made it clear that he wasn't afraid to challenge the system. 2. For the next few hours, the case became a battle of wits between Ava and Beck, with James offering support when needed. But every time Ava made a point, Beck pushed back with a veneer of indifference. His calmness only seemed to intensify the growing tension. Then, just as the day was drawing to a close, Ava was struck by a realization. This wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about something bigger. The line she had drawn between herself and the system was getting blurry. Was she still the one fighting for justice, or had she become part of the system herself? The days that followed the courtroom showdown felt like an endless spiral. Every moment Ava spent in that courtroom, every word spoken by Beck, every glance exchanged with James, it all replayed in her mind, like a broken record. It wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about what came next. Ava felt trapped between two worlds, the one she had built for herself, the one in which she was determined to bring justice to the oppressed, and the one that James seemed to represent, an uncertain future where feelings, emotions, and trust were tangled with a system she had come to distrust. As she sat at her desk in her apartment, sifting through case files late into the night, Ava found herself staring at the open page of a legal brief. But her mind kept drifting back to the courtroom, to James's unexpected appearance. What was he doing there? She still didn't understand why he had shown up when she hadn't asked for his help. The line between professional and personal had blurred in ways she wasn't prepared for, and as much as she wanted to believe his intentions were pure, part of her felt like she was walking a razor's edge. The next morning, Ava's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen. James Matthews. Her stomach twisted. Against her better judgment, she answered. "Hey," James greeted, his voice warm yet cautious, as if sensing her hesitation. "How's it going?" Ava leaned back in her chair, letting out a sigh. "I don't know, I'm trying to keep it together." "I get that," James replied, his tone shifting to something more serious. "But I have to ask, how are you really doing?" She hesitated, her fingers running through her hair as she tried to sort through her thoughts. It felt like a trap. She didn't want to expose herself, not again. She wasn't sure if she could handle another person seeing her vulnerabilities. Not right now. "I'm fine," she said flatly, though the words felt hollow. James paused. "Ava, you don't have to do this alone. I'm not going anywhere." His words, meant to comfort, had the opposite effect. They felt like chains, dragging her deeper into something she wasn't sure she wanted to be a part of. "You don't understand, James," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I can't just let go, not even for a second. If I do, everything I've worked for, everything I've sacrificed will come crashing down. I'm not asking you to let go," he said quietly. "I'm asking you to let someone in. I want to help. You don't have to carry this burden alone." Ava's heart raced, her pulse pounding in her ears. It was exactly what she didn't want to hear, the very thing she feared most. Needing someone. "I don't need saving, James," she said, her voice sharp. James was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his words were softer. "Maybe you don't need saving, but we all need someone to lean on sometimes. Even you." Ava gritted her teeth, angry at herself for feeling so vulnerable, angry at him for pushing her when she wasn't ready to open up. She ended the call abruptly, but she could still hear the lingering echo of his voice in her mind. "Maybe you don't need saving, but we all need someone to lean on sometimes." That evening, the case took a turn. The defense's star witness, Officer Beck, had been cross-examined, but he wasn't finished. His team was calling for a motion to dismiss, arguing that the prosecution had failed to prove a pattern of police misconduct. The courtroom had grown tense as the judge prepared to rule. On the motion, if the judge sided with the defense, the case could be dismissed without a verdict, and Jamar's death would go unpunished. Ava stood in front of the courtroom, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't let that happen. The truth was right, there staring everyone in the face. The autopsy, the video footage, the testimonies from other officers, all of it pointed to the same conclusion: excessive force. But she wasn't just fighting a case. She was fighting a system that had been rigged from the start, a system that had protected people like Officer Beck and allowed them to continue abusing their power without consequence. As the judge deliberated, Ava's thoughts turned dark. She knew the stakes. If this case was dismissed, it would send a message that the system was broken beyond repair, that even when the truth was clear, justice could be denied. But there was something deeper. Something that twisted in her gut as she looked at Beck, sitting confidently on the witness stand. She hated him, not just for what he had done to Jamar, but for what he represented. Everything she had fought against, Ava felt a burning need for retribution, for justice. She could already feel the anger rising within her, threatening to overtake her professional composure. The line between justice and vengeance was blurring, and she didn't know if she could stop it. The judge finally returned to the bench. The room was silent, every eye fixed on him. After reviewing the evidence, he began, his voice cool. "The motion to dismiss is denied. The case will proceed to trial." The room erupted in murmurs of approval from the prosecution and gasps of disbelief from the defense. Ava felt her breath catch in her throat. The fight wasn't over yet, but this was a victory for now. As she left the courtroom, her mind was reeling. She knew she had made the right choice in pushing forward, but the weight of what was to come settled heavily on her shoulders. This was just the beginning. The fight was far from over, and she was no longer sure she was equipped to handle what lay ahead. And then, as if on cue, her phone buzzed once again. Another call from James. She ignored it. but his words echoed in her mind once more. Maybe. You don't need saving, but we all need someone to lean on sometimes. The courtroom buzzed with activity, but Ava felt detached, like she was watching everything unfold from a distance. She had won the battle today, but she knew the war was far from over. Officer Beck had been rattled, but his defense was just getting started. And now, the real work began. As Ava walked out of the courthouse, the weight of the day's events began to settle heavily on her shoulders. She'd just secured the continuation of the trial, but the closer she got to the truth, the more tangled the threads became. Ava didn't go home right after the hearing. Instead, she headed straight to her office. It was after hours, but the building was still buzzing with the occasional sound of a phone ringing or the soft clicking of keyboards. She had a lot to think about, and she needed to find answers. She locked the door to her office and spread the case files out across the desk. The more she reviewed the information, the more she felt like something didn't add up. Everything pointed to excessive force, everything except the testimony of the officers, including Beck. Ava sat back in her chair, staring at the documents in front of her. Something was off about the way the case had been handled from the beginning. Beck wasn't just a rogue officer. He was part of a much larger network, and she had a suspicion that it wasn't just the police force he was connected to. She opened her laptop and began typing furiously, digging into public records, searching for anything that could tie Beck and his colleagues to something more sinister. After hours of sifting through pages of data, one name kept popping up: Franklin Hayes. Hayes was a local businessman with a history of connections to various city officials, but it was his ties to the police department that caught Ava's attention. Hayes had been involved in several lawsuits related to police misconduct, though he always seemed to slip through the cracks. It was clear he had influence, and Ava had a sinking feeling that he was somehow connected to the cover-up of Jamar's death. Her phone rang again, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. It was James. Ava hesitated before answering, her stomach churning with uncertainty. "James," she said, her voice guarded. "Ava," James replied, his tone gentle but firm. "I know you're busy, but we need to talk." She rubbed her temples, feeling the tension in her head. "I'm not in the mood for another lecture, James," he sighed. "This isn't a lecture. I'm trying to help you see the bigger picture. You're digging into this case, and I get it. But you're not seeing all the pieces yet. You're too close to it. I know what I'm doing," she snapped, a sharp edge to her voice. "And I don't need your help, not right now." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before James spoke again, his voice quieter. "Now, Ava, I don't think you realize how deep this goes. If you keep pushing, you might be playing into someone else's hand." Her heart skipped a beat. Was he talking about Hayes? Ava clenched her jaw. "What do you mean? You think I'm just chasing ghosts?" "No, I think you're getting too close to something you're not ready for," he said, his voice heavy with concern. "I've seen how these cases play out. The deeper you dig, the more you'll expose, and the more dangerous it becomes." Ava's mind was racing. Was James right? Was she opening doors that should stay closed? She didn't have time to second-guess herself. Not now. "I'm not backing down," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Not when it comes to Jamar, not when it comes to justice." James was silent for a long moment before he spoke. Again. "Just be careful, Ava, please." Before she could respond, the line went dead. Ava sat there for a moment, staring at the phone in her hand. She was used to fighting alone, but now, for the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of the battle press on her chest. The next morning, Ava arrived at her office early. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something crucial that could crack the case wide open. And there it was, buried deep in the public records. A small, seemingly insignificant detail in one of Hayes's lawsuits caught her attention. A police officer had been named as a witness in the case, but the name had been redacted. She was sure this wasn't a coincidence. The officer in question had to be Beck. Her pulse quickened. This was it. The connection she had been looking for. She now had evidence that linked Hayes directly to the cover-up of Jamar's death. But Ava knew this wasn't enough. She needed more than just a paper trail. She needed witnesses, hard evidence. something that would make the connection undeniable. Ava's next move was risky, but she didn't care. She reached out to an old friend, someone she knew had been working on the inside of the police department, Detective Raymond Harris. He wasn't part of the corruption, but he knew about it, and he'd helped her in the past when she'd needed information on shady cops. It took several attempts to reach him, but eventually he picked up. His voice was low and cautious, just as she remembered it. "Ava, I thought you'd stayed away from this stuff," he said, his tone tinged with concern. "I need your help, Raymond," she said, not wasting time with pleasantries. "There's something going on here, something bigger than we realize. I need to know everything you can about Franklin Hayes and his connection to the department." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "You're asking for a lot, Ava," he said finally. "If you're right, you're walking into something dangerous." "I know, but I need to know the truth." Raymond sighed. "All right, give me a day or two. I'll see what I can find." As Ava hung up, she felt a strange sense of relief. She wasn't alone in this anymore. Raymond would get her the evidence she needed to take down Hayes and Beck. She wasn't just fighting a cop anymore. She was fighting a corrupt system, one that had been covering up abuses for far too long. But as Ava walked out of her office later that evening, a car pulled up beside her, and she froze. The window rolled down slowly, revealing the cold, hard face of Officer Beck. "You've been asking the wrong questions, Ava," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You might want to rethink your next move." Ava felt a chill run down her spine. She was being watched. But that didn't matter anymore. She had come too far to stop now. Ava could still feel the lingering weight of Beck's words as she walked back to her apartment. "You've been asking the wrong questions, Ava." His voice echoed in her ears, as if warning her to back down before it was too late. She gripped, her purse tightly, every nerve in her body on edge. As she entered her apartment, she locked the door behind her and slumped against it. She hadn't expected the confrontation with Beck, but she should have known it was coming. When you dig too deep into a system this corrupt, there are always consequences. Ava had spent years fighting for justice, navigating the roughest parts of the legal system, but now for the first time she felt the full weight of her actions. This was personal. It had started with Jamar, but now it was about everything she'd worked for. Her career, her integrity, her belief that justice could prevail. If she backed down now, everything she had fought for would be in vain. The phone buzzed on her kitchen counter, and she grabbed it quickly, hoping for good news. It was Raymond. She answered without hesitation. "Raymond, do you have anything?" "I found something," Raymond said, his voice grim. "But it's not what you think. Hayes is connected to more than just the police. There's money moving behind the scenes, business deals, influence, political support. He's got a lot of people backing him, and they're not going to let this case go down without a fight." Ava swallowed hard. She had suspected something like this, but hearing it confirmed made the threat feel much more real. "I need everything you have, Raymond. Every piece of the puzzle. We're running out of time." Raymond paused. "Ava, you need to be careful. If you go public with this, you could expose more than you're ready for. These people, they'll come after you, and they'll make sure you never see this case through. I've seen it happen before." She knew what he meant. This wasn't just about taking down a corrupt officer anymore. This was about dismantling a whole system. "I don't care," Ava said, her voice hardening. "I'm not backing down now. We've come too far." The next day, the tension in the courthouse was palpable. The defense team was playing their final cards, trying to sway the jury with their last-ditch efforts to paint Jamar as a dangerous criminal. They were doing everything they could to distract from the truth, to turn the focus back to the supposed actions that led to Jamar's death. But Ava wasn't having it. As she walked into the courtroom, she noticed a few familiar faces in the audience, people who had been following the trial closely, hoping for justice. She steeled herself. Today was the day that everything could change. The trial proceeded as expected, but Ava's mind wasn't entirely on the arguments being presented. Her thoughts kept racing to the files Raymond had sent her late last night. The truth was out there. It just needed to be exposed. Hayes's connections ran deep, far deeper than she had ever anticipated. As the defense called their final witnesses, Ava's eyes flickered over to Beck, who sat in the defendant's chair, his gaze cold and calculating. She didn't trust him. But she also didn't trust the system that allowed him to sit there with impunity. The prosecutor, a man named George Willis, stood up and began his closing arguments. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, his voice booming with authority, "the evidence in this case is clear. Officer Beck did not just violate his oath of duty, he committed a crime that cannot be overlooked, and he must be held accountable. He shaved the head of a woman in his custody, humiliating her in front of a courtroom. He abused his power in the worst way possible." Ava's heart began to race. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. Willis paused, letting the weight of his words sink in before continuing. "But this case isn't just about one officer's actions. This case is about the systemic corruption that allowed someone like Beck to operate with no consequences for far too long. It's about the culture that shields bad cops and corrupt officials. We cannot let this go any longer." The jury watched intently as Willis made his final remarks, his voice impassioned, but Ava knew the real battle was just beginning. That evening, as Ava returned to her apartment, her phone buzzed once again. This time, it was a message from Raymond. "They know you're close, be careful." Ava's heart skipped a beat. It was a warning, and the realization hit her hard. She was being watched. The next morning, she made her way to the courthouse with a knot in her stomach. She knew that today's verdict would either break the case wide open or cause everything to implode. As the judge prepared to give his instructions to the jury, the tension in the air was unbearable. This was it. Either Beck would face justice or the system would swallow another victim whole. Ava took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. This wasn't just about bringing one cop to trial anymore. This was about exposing the entire network of corruption that had been festering under the surface for years. She wasn't just fighting for Jamar's justice anymore. She was fighting for every person who had been silenced by the system. The jury deliberated for what seemed like hours. The courtroom was silent. The only sound the shuffle of papers and the occasional whisper between the attorneys. Ava's nerves were on edge, and she could feel the weight of the decision bearing down on her. And then the door to the jury room opened. The foreman stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Will the defendant please rise?" the judge asked. Ava held her breath as Beck stood, his face impassive. She glanced at the defense team who were trying to maintain their composure. "On the charge of misconduct," the foreman began, "we find the defendant guilty." Ava's heart raced. Guilty. The courtroom erupted in applause from the prosecution side, while the defense team's faces fell in disbelief. But Ava didn't feel elation. She felt something else, something deeper. A sense of vindication, yes, but also the realization that the fight wasn't over. As Ava left the courtroom, her phone buzzed again. Another message from Raymond. "It's not over. Hayes won't let this go. Watch your back." The weight of the warning settled over her like a shadow. This was just the beginning. The victory in the courtroom was still fresh in Ava's mind. But as she left the courthouse, the triumph felt hollow. Guilty. It was the word she had longed to hear, yet it didn't bring her the relief she expected. Not when the battle was far from over. She was met with a flurry of activity outside the courthouse, a mix of reporters, protesters, and onlookers hoping for answers. Ava moved quickly, her coat pulled tightly around her as she navigated through the crowd. She had become a target in more ways than one. That night Ava barely slept. Her mind raced, replaying every moment of the trial, every piece of evidence, every argument made. She knew the victory wasn't just about Beck. Hayes was still out there, and the system that had allowed Beck to thrive was still in place, waiting for her to slip up. Ava was no stranger to fighting battles on her own, but the stakes had never been this high. Hayes wasn't just some corrupt businessman, he was part of something much larger. And if Ava wanted to see this through, she would have to confront more than just him. The next morning she received another cryptic message, this time from someone she didn't recognize. "They're watching you. Don't trust anyone." Ava's hand trembled as she set the phone down. The feeling of being hunted had become all too real. Ava needed to meet with Raymond. He had promised her information, and she was certain that he had uncovered something crucial about Hayes. But the danger was escalating. Hayes had his hands in so many places, and if she didn't move quickly, it would all slip through her fingers. She arranged to meet Raymond in a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. The location was deliberately nondescript, one of the few places where they wouldn't be under surveillance. Ava arrived early, her eyes scanning the surroundings, always alert. Raymond showed up about 20 minutes later, his face tense. He didn't look like the man she had known for years, someone who had always been calm, composed, and methodical. Today, he looked like someone who had just been running for his life. "Raymond," Ava greeted him, her voice low. "What's going on?" He sat down across from her, his eyes darting over his shoulder before locking with hers. "Ava, this is bigger than we thought. Hayes isn't just running a few shady business deals. He's connected to something much more dangerous, organized crime, political influence. He's been pulling strings behind the scenes for years." Ava's heart sank. "What do you mean?" Raymond leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "There's a network of people protecting him, cops, politicians, even judges. They've covered up his crimes for years, and now they're circling the wagons, trying to make sure you don't get any further." Ava absorbed the weight of his words. She had known Hayes was powerful, but this was something else entirely. "How do we bring him down?" Raymond hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "The problem is, Ava, we don't have enough. The evidence we've gathered so far is circumstantial at best. Without a solid witness or hard proof, it's just another conspiracy theory to the powers that be." Ava knew Raymond was right. She had no shortage of theories, but theories didn't win trials. Proof did. She couldn't keep going down this road without something concrete to take down Hayes and his network. As Ava made her way back to her apartment, the message from Raymond still lingered in her mind. The deeper she dug, the more she was becoming entangled in a web of corruption and power that she wasn't sure she could escape from. Was she already too far in? The sound of footsteps behind her startled her, but when she turned around there was no one there. Her pulse quickened as she quickened her pace, but the unsettling feeling stayed with her. That night, as she sat in her living room, the phone rang again. This time it was a number she recognized. "James," she said, answering the phone quickly. "Ava, listen to me." James's voice was frantic. "I've been getting calls all day from people inside the system. They know what you're doing. They know you're onto something big, and they're not happy about it." Ava's stomach tightened. "What does that mean? Who's calling you?" James paused. "I don't know, but they're pushing back hard. People who used to have your back, they're pulling away. You're getting too close to something dangerous, Ava." "I'm not stopping, James," she replied, her voice unwavering. "Not now, not after everything that's happened." There was a heavy sigh on the other end of the line. "I know you won't. But please, be careful. This thing could end. Stop taking you down." Over the next few days, the tension in the air only thickened. The media buzzed with updates on Beck's conviction, and while some celebrated, others, especially those who had something to lose, worked to discredit Ava. They painted her as a crusader gone too far, a judge who had let personal vendettas cloud her judgment. But Ava knew the truth, and that was all that mattered. Then, just as she thought she might have a moment to regroup, the unexpected happened. She received a call from a number she didn't recognize. "Ava," a deep voice said, sending chills down her spine. "You've made a lot of noise, but you've got a choice to make. You can keep digging or you can let it go. Either way, you're going to pay for this." Ava's heart pounded. It was Hayes. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice shaking but steady. "If you think I'm going to back down, you don't know me." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Hayes's voice returned, colder than before. "You've made a dangerous mistake, Ava. We don't take kindly to people like you trying to tear everything down." The line went dead. Ava stood in her living room, the weight of his words sinking in. She had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. But she had a choice to make. Would she back down and let the system swallow her whole, or would she risk everything to take it down once and for all? There was no turning back now. Ava wasn't just fighting for Jamar anymore. She was fighting for the truth, no matter the cost. The quiet hum of the city at night felt different now. Ava walked through the empty streets, her heart racing as she tried to push the fear aside. She had never been this close to taking down the man behind the corruption that had plagued so many lives. The truth was within her grasp, but so was the danger. Tonight there would be no more playing by the rules. After her conversation with Hayes, Ava knew the path forward wouldn't be easy. She had crossed a line. Hayes had made it clear that he would stop at nothing to protect himself and his empire. Ava had only one choice left. She had to hit him where it hurt, hard. But in this world of smoke and mirrors, Ava needed more than just willpower. She needed leverage. She needed evidence. That's where Raymond came in. They had been working together in secret for weeks now, piecing together a trail of dirty deals, illicit contacts, and hidden funds that connected Hayes to far more than anyone could have imagined. It was a massive web, but Raymond had found a way to trace the threads to the very core of Hayes's operation. Ava arrived at their meeting spot, a small, discreet law office at the edge of the city. Raymond was already inside, pacing the room as he went over the final pieces of the puzzle. "Ava, this is it," Raymond said, his voice tight with urgency. "We've got the documentation, the bank records, and a list of names, but you need to act fast. Hayes is already making moves. He knows you're getting close." Ava took the papers from him, scanning the names and figures. It was all there. The corruption, the payoffs, the names of politicians, judges, and even other law enforcement officers involved. Her heart raced as she read through the evidence. This wasn't just about Beck anymore. This was about bringing down an entire system. "I'm taking this to the press," Ava said firmly. "It's time for the world to see the truth. No more hiding." Raymond shook his head, his eyes wide with concern. "Ava, if you go public with this, if you expose everything, it won't just be Hayes who comes after you. It'll be everyone who's ever been in his pocket. You'll be a target. You need to think this through." "I've thought it through," she replied, her voice steady, "and I'm not backing down." Raymond met her gaze, a mixture of respect and worry in his eyes. "Then we need to make sure we're covered. If we're going to do this, we can't leave anything to chance." Later that evening, as Ava prepared to make the final move, she couldn't shake the sense that something was off. It was too easy, too smooth. She had already taken steps to ensure that the evidence was securely stored, that backup copies had been made, and that the press would have everything they needed. But there was a nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach, as though something or someone was watching her. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from James. "I've been hearing things, Ava. People are worried about you. Hayes has people everywhere. Don't do anything rash." Ava stared at the screen for a moment before typing her response. It's too late to turn back now. The next day, the world changed. Ava's press conference was scheduled for noon. The room was packed with reporters, cameras ready to capture the moment that could bring Hayes and his entire network to its knees. She stood at the podium, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Ava took a deep breath. She had come this far, and there was no turning back. The lights dimmed, and the buzz in the room fell silent. Ava stepped up to the microphone, her face calm but her heart pounding in her chest. "Thank you all for being here today," Ava began, her voice strong. "What I'm about to share with you is not just a story about one corrupt cop. This is a story about a system that has allowed the abuse of power to flourish unchecked for far too long. A system that has protected criminals instead of holding them accountable." Ava paused, letting the words sink in. She could feel the eyes of the room on her. Every camera, every reporter, every pair of eyes waiting for the truth to spill out. She took a breath and continued. "I stand here today not just as a judge, but as a person who believes in justice. And I believe that justice must be served. What you will see today are documents, testimonies, and records that trace the corruption back to its source, Hayes. A man who has used his wealth, his influence, and his power to destroy lives and cover up his crimes." The room erupted in murmurs, but Ava pressed on. "I'm here to expose the truth. The people who have covered up these crimes will no longer be allowed to hide. The system that has allowed them to thrive will be held accountable. We are not just fighting for one man's conviction. We are fighting for the future of our justice system." She could feel the weight of her own words. She wasn't just making an accusation. She was taking a stand for everything she believed in. This was the moment she had fought for, and now it was in the hands of the public. Later that day, as the press conference gained national attention, Ava felt a sense of unease. The world was reacting, some in outrage, some in disbelief. But what struck her most was the silence from Hayes. He hadn't made a public statement. He hadn't denied the allegations. It was almost as though he was waiting for something. That evening, as Ava left the courthouse, she noticed a black SUV parked across the street. Her stomach churned. It was an unmistakable sign that someone was watching her. The next morning, as she prepared to head into work, she received a call from an unknown number. She hesitated, but then answered. "Ava," Hayes's voice was cold and calm. "You've made a big mistake. You've exposed yourself, and now there's no way out." Ava's pulse quickened, but she stood firm. "It's over, Hayes. The truth is out. You won't get away with it this time." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Hayes spoke again. "Don't be so sure. People like me don't fall, but people like you, Ava, don't know how to play the game." Before she could respond, the line went dead. Ava's hands trembled as she hung up the phone. Hayes wasn't just angry. He was preparing for war, and she had just fired the first shot. The day after her press conference, the world felt different. The weight of what Ava had unleashed settled heavily on her shoulders. The news was everywhere. Hayes's name was splashed across headlines, but so was hers. The world now knew her face, her name, her fight. But as much as she wanted to believe in the power of truth, she couldn't ignore the growing sense of danger that followed her every step. Hayes had a network of people, some in the shadows, others in plain sight, and she could feel their eyes on her. Ava couldn't shake the feeling that she was being hunted. The black SUV had parked outside her apartment again. This time, Ava didn't just notice it from her window. She saw the men inside, faces hidden behind tinted glass. Her instincts told her that Hayes wasn't going to let her have this victory, not without a fight. She couldn't risk being taken by surprise. Every move she made, she had to think 3 steps ahead. Hayes was calculating. She needed to stay 1 step ahead, but the walls were closing in. The next morning, Ava went into the courthouse, but it wasn't the usual hum of a busy day. Something felt off. As she entered her chambers, she found a note slipped under her door. The handwriting was familiar, though she hadn't seen it in years. "You're playing a dangerous game. You should have stayed out of it." There was no name, but the threat was clear. Hayes wasn't going to just sit back and let her dismantle his empire. But who else was involved? How deep did this corruption run? In the quiet of her office, Ava examined the documents Raymond had given her, the ones that had been printed and distributed to the press. There was no turning back now. This wasn't just about her reputation. It was about every life that had been ruined because of men like Hayes. She couldn't afford to fail. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID read, "James." "Ava," James's voice was tight. "I've been hearing things. There's a storm coming. I've gotten word that Hayes is pulling strings in the background. People are starting to turn on you. Some of the people you thought you could trust." Ava's pulse quickened. She had expected resistance, but hearing it from James, the people she trusted were starting to crumble. The pressure was beginning to show. "What do you mean, turning on me?" Ava asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "I mean people are scared, Ava. They're being threatened. Some of them are backing down, pulling their support. You're not the only one fighting this battle anymore. The game is changing." Ava stared at the phone, feeling the walls closing in once more. She had already fought for this moment, and she wasn't about to give it up now. "I'm not stopping, James. I'm all in. This is bigger than just me." James's voice softened. "I know, but please, take care of yourself. You're walking into a trap and you need to be prepared." The weight of James's warning lingered as Ava made her way back to her apartment that evening. Every corner felt dangerous. Every shadow felt threatening. But she was determined. The evidence was out there, and now the world was watching. When she arrived home, she noticed something strange. Her door, which she had locked tightly, was slightly ajar. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she stepped inside. Her apartment had been searched. Drawers were open. Papers were scattered. The evidence she had carefully organized was gone. Ava's mind raced. Hayes had sent a message. She quickly grabbed her phone and sent a message to Raymond. "It's gone. They've been in my apartment." The response came quickly. "Get out, now." Ava didn't hesitate. She grabbed her most important files, anything that could be used against Hayes, and fled the apartment without looking back. That night, Ava stayed in a safe house, one of the few places that felt secure. Raymond had connections, and for now, that was the only thing keeping her one step ahead of Hayes and his network. But she knew this couldn't last. She couldn't stay hidden forever. She needed a plan. The next morning, Ava sat down with Raymond in the safe house, the air thick with tension. They had one option left: to go public with everything, to expose Hayes completely before he had the chance to strike back. But there was a risk. Once they did that, there was no going back. "We have to move quickly," Ava said, her voice steady despite the storm of thoughts swirling in her mind. "If Hayes is going to retaliate, we need to be ready. We can't let him spin this story his way. We take control now, or we risk losing everything." Raymond nodded. "The documents we've got are airtight, but there's more. I've dug up something that links Hayes directly to one of the highest offices in the city. This isn't just about him anymore. This goes all the way to the top." Ava's eyes narrowed. She hadn't expected this. The corruption went all the way to the city's leadership. "We can't let this go unnoticed," she said, her voice filled with resolve. "We have to bring this to light now, before he has a chance to bury it. The public needs to know everything." Later that day, Ava held a second press conference. This time, she wasn't just addressing the media about the conviction. She was giving them the full story, the documents, the corruption, everything. It was a calculated risk, but it was the only choice she had left. She stepped to the podium, the weight of the truth pressing down on her. "What I'm about to reveal is not just about one corrupt cop. This is about a system, a city, a country that has allowed these criminals to thrive unchecked. I've seen it firsthand, and I won't stand by while innocent lives are destroyed." The crowd was hushed. Reporters exchanged glances, unsure of what they were about to hear. Ava held up the documents, bank records, names of high-ranking officials, and details of Hayes' far-reaching network. "This man, Hayes, is just the beginning. Behind him is a network of people, politicians, judges, cops, who have used their power to keep people like him in control. I'm not just fighting for justice anymore. I'm fighting to bring this system down." The silence in the room was deafening. Ava's words were out in the open now, and there was no taking them back. As the press conference wrapped up, Ava received an urgent call from James. "Ava, you've made the biggest mistake of your life," his voice was frantic. "Hayes is making moves. He's coming for you, and this time he won't stop until you're gone." Ava's heart raced as she realized the stakes had just gotten even higher. She wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. She was fighting for her life. Ava didn't sleep that night. Her mind raced, and every little sound outside her window felt like an impending threat. She knew Hayes wasn't just a corrupt cop. He was a monster with connections that reached into the highest offices in the city, into the very fabric of the system that was supposed to protect the people. Now he was coming for her, and she had no intention of backing down. The following morning, Ava received a chilling text message from Raymond. "Hayes isn't going to stop. He's making moves. Be ready. You're not safe." Her breath caught in her throat. She had hoped foolishly that the press conference would have been the final blow, that the truth would be enough to bring him down. But Hayes was far more dangerous than she had anticipated. Ava had always been a fighter, but now she was fighting for her life. She called James immediately. "I need you to check with your sources. Find out everything you can about Hayes' next move. I need to know what he's planning." "I'm on it," James replied, his voice tense. "But you need to lay low, Ava. You've stirred up a hornet's nest, and Hayes isn't the kind of guy who just lets you walk away." It didn't take long for the city to start feeling the ripple effects of Ava's revelations. The media was in overdrive, with public outcry demanding justice, but Hayes was already working his way through the cracks. Ava's own phone lines were buzzing with threats. Unmarked cars followed her wherever she went. and more than once she thought she saw a shadow lurking in the dark corners of the courthouse. But Ava wasn't afraid. She couldn't afford to be. She took extra precautions now, traveling with armed escorts provided by the city's security team. Every door was double-checked, every window locked. But she knew this wasn't enough. Hayes was far too connected. She needed more than just protection. She needed to outsmart him, beat him at his own game. 2 days after the press conference, Ava received an anonymous tip. The information was shocking. Hayes had infiltrated nearly every level of law enforcement in the city. He had informants everywhere, some in positions of power she never could have imagined. The city's corruption was so deeply embedded that even the most trusted figures were compromised. The anonymous tip included a name, one of Hayes's closest allies, a senior officer in the police force, a man who had been in the background of many of the cases Ava had worked on over the years. Officer Matt Rinaldi. Ava couldn't let this go. Rinaldi was the key to bringing Hayes down for good. But exposing him meant diving deeper into the police department's own dark underbelly, a place where secrets were buried and loyalties were bought. But Ava had no choice. She couldn't let Hayes win. Ava sat across from Raymond at their usual meeting spot, the mood grim. "Rinaldi," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we need to take him down. He's the one helping Hayes stay untouchable. He's the weak link in the chain." Raymond nodded, his face serious. "I've been digging into Rinaldi. He's been part of Hayes's operation for years. But going after him is risky. If he knows we're onto him, we could be walking straight into a trap." "I'm not waiting any longer," Ava said, determination hardening her resolve. "We go after him now. This is the only chance we have. Hayes won't stop until he's destroyed me, and I'm not going to let him win." They set the plan in motion, but Ava knew there was no room for error. Rinaldi had a network of officers who would protect him at all costs. If Ava didn't take him down quickly, she would become the target. That night, as Ava and Raymond worked, into the late hours, a knock on the door startled them both. Ava's heart skipped a beat. She glanced at Raymond, who was already on alert. Raymond cautiously walked to the door, peering through the peephole. His expression changed instantly. "It's James." Ava opened the door, her mind spinning. "What's going on?" James stepped inside, his face drawn and grim. "Ava, it's bad. Rinaldi's gone underground. Hayes has mobilized everything. He's pulling strings to shut this down. I don't think you realize just how far he's willing to go. You need to disappear for a while." Ava shook her head. "I can't hide, James, not now. This is my fight. If I disappear, they'll think they've won." "You don't get it," James said, his voice rising. "Hayes isn't just going after you anymore. He's going after anyone you've ever known, anyone who's helped you. You're putting Raymond at risk. You're putting your own family at risk." Ava's mind raced. James was right. Hayes was moving faster than she anticipated. This wasn't just about one woman anymore. It was about an entire network of corruption. And Ava knew that if she was going to survive, she needed to act quickly. The next morning, Ava received a call from the one person she didn't expect. Officer Rinaldi. "Ava, I know what you're doing," he said, his voice cool and calm. "You're playing with fire. You've crossed a line and you'll regret it." Ava could feel the weight of his words. He wasn't threatening her. He was trying to warn her. "Where are you, Rinaldi?" Ava demanded. "Are you still working for Hayes? Do you really think I'm going to let him get away with this?" Rinaldi chuckled darkly. "You have no idea what you're up against. Hayes won't be taken down by someone like you." The call ended abruptly, and Ava felt her stomach churn. Hayes was mobilizing everything. The time for games was over. She had to act, and fast. The web of lies was unraveling, and she wasn't about to let Hayes pull her down with it. Later that day, Ava made the decision to take the ultimate risk. She would confront Hayes directly. She knew it was dangerous, but there was no other choice. The longer she waited, the more power he gained. Ava was done hiding in the shadows. Ava sat at the edge of her bed, her fingers tightly gripping the edge of her phone. The weight of the decision was heavier than any she'd ever made. Confronting Hayes directly could be the end of her, and yet it felt like the only way forward. She had spent too long hiding, too long playing it safe. If she truly wanted justice, If she truly wanted to stop Hayes from destroying everything she'd worked for, she had no choice but to walk straight into the lion's den. The plan was simple, but dangerous. She had a meeting scheduled with the one person who could help her. Take Hayes down, Officer Rinaldi. She didn't trust him, but he was the key to breaking through the corruption that had permeated every corner of the city. Ava stood in front of the mirror, her reflection staring back at her with a mixture of defiance and fear. She had never felt more alone, but she had also never felt more sure of herself. The woman in the mirror wasn't the same one who had walked into that courtroom months ago, humiliated and broken. This woman was someone who had seen the depths of corruption, someone who had been pushed to the edge and was now ready to fight for what was right. She looked at the clock. It was time. The meeting with Rinaldi was set for an old, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, far enough from the eyes of the city, but not too far to escape quickly. She didn't trust anyone, not even him, but this was her shot. If she could convince him to turn on Hayes, the entire operation could crumble. But Ava knew that, in doing so, she was walking a dangerous line. There was no guarantee that Rinaldi would cooperate. The warehouse was dark and silent when Ava arrived. She stepped out of the car, the sound of her heels clicking against the cracked pavement breaking the silence. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she kept walking. No turning back now. As she approached the entrance, the door creaked open. A tall figure stepped out from the shadows. It was Rinaldi. His eyes flickered with something unreadable as he looked at her, his expression neutral but alert. "You came," he said, his voice almost surprised. "I didn't come this far to back out." "Now," Ava replied, her voice steady. "I need you, Rinaldi. This is your chance to make things right." He stared at her for a moment, the tension thick in the air. "You think you can change everything by going after Hayes? You have no idea what you're dealing with. Hayes is untouchable." "You and I both know that." Ava's eyes hardened. "I don't care how untouchable he seems. You know as well as I do that he's a cancer to this city. And you've been helping him. You've been part of the problem." Rinaldi stepped closer, his voice lowering. "I don't owe you anything. You don't understand what it's like to be in my position. Hayes has power, real power. He controls the system. If I turn on him, it's over for me. I'll be a target. You think he'll let me walk away clean? He'll make sure I disappear. You think you can protect me?" Ava's heart raced. She could hear the fear in his voice, but there was something else too. Guilt. He wasn't beyond redemption. Not yet. "You don't have to be afraid, Rinaldi. If we bring him down, we take down the whole network. We expose everything. Hayes can't protect you forever, and you won't be alone in this. I'll make sure of that." For a moment, Rinaldi didn't speak. His eyes flickered toward the shadows as though he was weighing his options. Ava could see the internal struggle in his face. He wanted to break free, but he was terrified of the consequences. Finally, he spoke. "You don't get it. If I betray Hayes, it's not just him I'll be going up against. He has friends everywhere, judges, cops, politicians. You think they'll let me live?" Ava stepped closer, her voice resolute. "We don't have to do it alone. There are people on our side, Rinaldi. If you help me take him down, we'll make sure Hayes and his network are exposed. We have everything we need. The public is on our side now. They won't let him get away." With this, Rinaldi was silent for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the ground as though contemplating the weight of her words. Ava could see the conflict raging inside him, the fear, the guilt, the possibility of redemption. Then, without warning, he nodded. "All right, I'll help you. But we do this carefully. I don't trust anyone. But if you've got the goods, just know this. I won't back down, but I'm not doing this out of the goodness of my heart. I'm doing this because I want out." Ava breathed a sigh of relief. She had expected resistance, but this was different. This was the first step in a battle she could win. That night, Ava and Rinaldi worked together to compile all the evidence they had on Hayes, everything from his financial dealings to the officers he had in his pocket. It was a meticulous task, one that required hours of work, but it was the only chance they had to expose Hayes for what he truly was. The documents they gathered would be the final nail in his coffin. Once they were in the right hands, Hayes wouldn't be able to wiggle his way out. This was it. The moment of reckoning. The next day, Ava stood before the press once more. This time, the air was electric with anticipation. The world was watching. This wasn't just a story about one woman's fight for justice. It was a story that would shake the very foundations of the corrupt system that had allowed men like Hayes to thrive. She held up the folder, the evidence, and with a steady hand, began to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, what I have here is the truth that Hayes and his allies have tried to bury for years. This is the information that exposes everything. His corruption, his manipulation, his crimes. No more hiding, no more lies. The time for justice is now. The room erupted into chaos as reporters scrambled to get the first glimpse of the documents. But Ava knew this was only the beginning. She had stepped into the fire and there was no turning back. Now it was time for Hayes to face the consequences of his actions. The courthouse buzzed with a quiet intensity that Ava hadn't felt before. The last few days had been a whirlwind. Press conferences, public outcry, and investigations into Hayes's deep web of corruption. The documents she had handed over were now in the hands of the district attorney's office, but the fight was far from over. Hayes wasn't going to let this go without a fight, and Ava knew that despite everything, he still had allies who would do anything to protect him. Ava sat in her office, staring out the window. The city had never felt more like a battlefield. The weight of the decisions she had made sat heavily on her shoulders. She could feel the tension in the air thick enough to taste. People were watching her, waiting for her next move. The stakes were higher than ever. Raymond's voice broke through her thoughts. Ava, you've got to stay sharp. Hayes isn't just going to sit back and let you destroy him. He's got too much power, too many people on his side. I know, Ava replied, her voice tight. But I've come too far to back down now. This is the last chance we have to take him down. If I don't do this, no one else will. At that moment, James walked into her office, looking worn and tired but determined. I've got word from my sources. Hayes is moving fast. He's pulling every string he can. The clock's ticking, Ava. If we don't act soon, he's going to make sure we regret it. Ava nodded, her face set in grim determination. Then it's time to make our move. They had a plan, a dangerous, high-risk plan. The evidence they had gathered against Hayes would be presented in court. But Ava knew it wouldn't be that. Simple. Hayes would fight tooth and nail to discredit the evidence, to cover his tracks. It would be a battle of wills, hers against a man who had spent his career destroying others to protect himself. But Ava had something he didn't: the truth. The day of the hearing arrived and the courtroom was packed. The media was there in full force, ready to cover the drama that was unfolding. Ava felt the weight of the eyes upon her as she entered the courtroom. She knew that her every move would be scrutinized, that everything she did would be under a microscope. But none of that mattered now. She had come too far to worry about what others thought. The judge took his seat and the proceedings began. On the other side of the room, Hayes sat with his legal team, his expression unreadable. Ava could feel his gaze on her, cold and calculating. He was ready to strike, but she wasn't going to let him win. Not this time. The prosecutor stepped forward, presenting the evidence they had gathered. The documents, the financial records, the witness statements. It was all there, laid out for everyone to see. The corruption that Hayes had worked so hard to hide was now exposed for the world to see. Ava watched as Hayes's defense team scrambled, trying to poke holes in the evidence, discrediting witnesses and spinning stories. But it wasn't enough. The truth was too strong. Ava's heart raced as she listened to the defense's desperate arguments. They were trying to turn the case on its head, to make her the villain, to make her the one on trial. Then it happened. Hayes stood up, his voice booming in the courtroom. "This is a lie, all of it. She's trying to destroy me and you're all falling for it." His voice shook with anger, but Ava could see the panic in his eyes. He was losing control. The judge called for order, but Hayes continued. "You're nothing but a pawn in a game you don't understand, Ava. You think you're fighting for justice, but you're just another tool in the system, being used by people who want me gone. I won't let you do this." Ava's heart pounded in her chest, but she remained calm. She had been waiting for this moment, for Hayes to show his true colors. His desperation was a sign that the walls were closing in on him. "I'm not your pawn, Hayes," she said, standing tall. I'm here because of the people you've destroyed, the lives you've ruined, and the truth that you've tried so hard to bury. You may have thought you were untouchable, but this is the reckoning. This is the moment when everything changes. The ow. Courtroom fell silent as her words hung in the air. Hayes looked stunned, his confidence slipping away. For the first time in a long time, Ava saw fear in his eyes. But it wasn't just her words that had shaken him. It was the truth. The truth had a power that nothing could withstand, not even the likes of Hayes. The rest of the trial played out in a blur. The defense's attempts to discredit the evidence only served to highlight the depth of the corruption. With each passing minute, it became clearer. Hayes was finished. His empire was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Finally, the judge called for a recess, and Ava stepped outside the courtroom for a brief moment of reprieve. She leaned against the cold stone wall, her hands trembling slightly. The adrenaline was beginning to wear off, and the gravity of what was happening was starting to settle in. Raymond approached her, his expression grim. "We've got him, Ava. It's over. He can't wriggle his way out of this one." Ava took a deep breath. "It's not over yet. We've got to make sure he pays for everything, every lie, every injustice. If we don't, then all of this was for nothing." As the trial continued, Ava remained focused, unwavering. She knew that the end was near, but she also knew that Hayes wouldn't go down without a fight. The real battle was just beginning. The final moments of the trial were a blur, but when the jury returned with their verdict, the tension in the room was palpable. Ava held her breath as the judge read the decision. "We, the jury, find the defendant. Officer Hayes guilty on all charges." The room erupted in applause, and Ava felt a wave of relief wash over her. But even as the victory settled in, she knew that this was just the beginning. The fight for justice was never truly over. It was a continuous battle, one that would require her to stay vigilant, to continue speaking out, and to always stand up for what was right. The courthouse was a place of solemn reflection as the final verdict was read, and the room that had once been filled with the tension of a long-fought battle now hummed with the quiet murmurs of relief. Ava stood outside, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of the stone steps, feeling the weight of the moment settle deep within her chest. Hayes was finally being held accountable. The city's corruption was being stripped bare, but the cost of this victory was greater than she had anticipated. The headlines flooded the media. "Corrupt cop convicted after black woman's brave testimony." The world knew her name now. Ava Moretti had become a symbol of defiance, of justice in a broken system. But as she walked through the crowd of reporters and photographers, the flashing cameras felt less like validation and more like a reminder of everything she had lost. She had come so far, but the emotional toll was immense. The war wasn't over, and the victory was bittersweet. She had taken down Hayes, but his network was still out there, waiting to retaliate. In the weeks that followed, Ava found herself caught in a whirlwind of media appearances, interviews, and a newfound sense of responsibility. But no matter how much attention she received, there was a gnawing emptiness inside her. The victory had come at a personal cost. She no longer recognized the woman in the mirror, the one who had walked into that courtroom full of fear, but who now stood as a symbol of courage. Her relationships had suffered too. Raymond and James, her closest allies, were constantly by her side, but even they could see how much the weight of everything was wearing her down. The emotional distance was becoming hard to ignore. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of meetings and press conferences, Ava returned to her apartment. She stepped inside, the familiar silence surrounding her like a heavy cloak. The weight of her decisions, the isolation she felt, were suffocating. She kicked off her shoes, her feet aching from the long day, and sank onto the couch. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. It was a message from Raymond. "How are you holding up?" She stared at the message for a long moment. The question had become a routine one, and the truth, how she really felt, seemed harder to admit each time. She wanted to say something comforting, something that would put his mind at ease, but the truth felt like a burden she couldn't share. Instead, she replied with a simple, "I'm fine. Just tired." She placed her phone down on the coffee table and ran her hands over her face. Her body was exhausted, but it was her mind that wouldn't quiet. The victory, the sense of justice she had fought for, should have felt liberating. But it didn't. The victory had exposed the cracks in everything she had been holding together. Later that night, Ava found herself sitting at the kitchen table, the dim light casting shadows across the room. Her mind kept returning to the same question: what now? She had spent so much of her life fighting for justice for others, but in doing so she had lost a part of herself. The woman who had entered this fight full of hope and determination now struggled with a deep loneliness. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Ava stood up, startled, as she wasn't expecting anyone. She walked over to the door, hesitated, and opened it. Standing in front of her was James, his expression serious yet gentle. "Mind if I come in?" he asked, stepping forward before she could respond. Ava stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. "What's going on, James?" He paused for a moment, before speaking, choosing his words carefully. "I know you've been burying yourself in the work, Ava, but you can't keep ignoring what's happening inside of you. I get it. You're trying to fix the world, but that doesn't mean you should forget about yourself in the process." Ava swallowed, feeling the sharp sting of his words. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You're not fine," he replied, his tone softer now. "You've been running on fumes for weeks. It's okay to admit that it's taking a toll on you. You've been through hell. You deserve to take a breath." Ava turned away, her gaze falling to the table. The vulnerability she had fought so hard to keep hidden was bubbling to the surface. She had always been the strong one, the one who kept fighting, who kept pushing forward no matter the cost. But now she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep it up. "Maybe it's time I stopped pretending," she said quietly, more to herself than to James. He sat down across from her, his presence calming. "You've done more than anyone could have expected. You brought down a monster, but no one can do it alone. You've got people who care about you, people who want to help. But you've got to let us." Ava finally looked up at him, her eyes tired but filled with gratitude. "I don't know how to let anyone help, James. I don't know how to stop fighting." "You don't have to stop fighting, Ava. You just need to know when to let others fight beside you." The next few days were a blur of reflection and decisions. Ava reached out to her team, including Raymond, James, and Officer Rinaldi, to discuss the next steps. They had made great strides, but the work wasn't done. There were still people to hold accountable, still corrupt officials to bring to justice. But for the first time in weeks, Ava didn't feel as if she was carrying the weight alone. Raymond sat across from her in the conference room, his voice low. "We've got enough to go after some of the others in Hayes' network. The investigation is moving forward, and we've got people from the inside who are willing to talk. We'll take them down one by one." Ava nodded, the familiar fire returning to her chest. She wasn't done yet, but now she wasn't alone. As the days passed, Ava began to feel something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time: hope. The victory against Hayes had been monumental, but it was just the beginning. She wasn't done. The fight for justice was ongoing, and with her team behind her, Ava knew they had the strength to finish what they had started. The dust had settled after Hayes' conviction, but Ava knew that the battle was far from over. The corruption in the police department was deep, a network that stretched far beyond one officer. With the momentum of Hayes' downfall, the team was more determined than ever to continue their fight. Yet, as Ava sat in the dimly lit conference room with Raymond, James, and Officer Rinaldi, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Raymond leaned forward, laying out a series of documents on the table. "We've got leads, Ava. A lot of them. The investigation into Hayes' connections is opening up new doors. People are talking, but there's one thing we need to be careful about." He paused, his eyes meeting Ava's. "This isn't just about Hayes anymore. We're dealing with some serious players." Ava nodded slowly, absorbing the gravity of his words. Hayes was only one part of the system. The deeper they dug, the more powerful the individuals they were up against became. "Who are we talking about?" she asked. "Names like Sheriff Lawson and Deputy Mayor Thorne have come up in the files we found," James interjected. "They've been pulling strings in the background for years. If Hayes was a foot soldier in this network, these guys are the generals. If we go after them, we're going to make some serious enemies. Ava looked down at the table, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She'd known this moment was coming. The higher the stakes, the more dangerous the fight. But she had already sacrificed too much to turn back now. "We don't have a choice," she said, her voice firm. "We've come too far. We can't let these people keep destroying lives." In the following weeks, the investigation into Sheriff Lawson and Deputy Mayor Thorne escalated quickly. Ava's team worked tirelessly, digging into financial records, conducting interviews with former and current employees, and trying to uncover any link between these powerful figures and the corruption that had plagued the department for years. But as they pressed forward, things started to get complicated, unsettling even. Ava began receiving anonymous threats. At first they were vague, strange phone calls, cryptic letters left on her doorstep. But the threats soon turned more direct. Her car was vandalized outside her apartment. The windows were shattered and the tires slashed. The police officers who had once sworn to protect her, the ones who had been her allies, were growing suspicious of her actions. "Don't let them intimidate you," Raymond said, his voice low as they met after the latest incident. "These are just tactics. They're trying to scare you off." "I'm not scared," Ava replied, though her voice trembled slightly. "I just didn't think it would get this ugly. It's like I'm walking a tightrope every day, just trying to stay one step ahead." Things took an even darker turn one evening when Ava was approached by a former officer who had once been a close friend of Hayes. His name was Carl Griggs, a man who had retired under questionable circumstances a few years ago. Carl was a man who had seen the worst of the department and had lived to regret the things he'd done, but he had never come forward. Until now. "Ava," Carl said, his voice shaky as he stepped into her office, "I've got information, the kind of stuff that'll bring them all down, but you've got to protect me too. I'm not just talking about Lawson and Thorne. There's more. There's a whole network of people, powerful people. If you go after them, you'll need to make sure you've got a plan to keep yourself safe." Ava's pulse quickened as Carl slid a manila folder across the table. "What kind of network?" Carl glanced over his shoulder, making sure no one was watching. "Think bigger than just the police. Think city officials, businessmen, even judges. They've all been in on it. Hayes was the foot soldier. Lawson and Thorne are the generals. But the kingpins, the ones who orchestrated everything, they're untouchable, unless you know how to play the game." Ava opened the folder carefully, her eyes scanning the documents inside. There were names, transactions, photographs, and connections that sent a chill down her spine. The scale of the corruption was staggering. These weren't just bad apples in the police force. This was a carefully constructed web of influence, money, and power stretching into every corner of the city. Over the next few days, Ava and her team analyzed the information Carl provided. The implications were terrifying. It wasn't just about bringing down a few crooked cops. This was about exposing an entire system that was built on lies and exploitation. Lawson and Thorne were just the tip of the iceberg. But with each new lead, the risk grew. It became clear that they were no longer just fighting corrupt officials. They were up against a network of people who had spent years perfecting the art of manipulation and control. Ava's team would have to tread carefully if they wanted to make sure their investigation didn't end in disaster. Ava's mind raced as she sat in the quiet of her office late one evening, staring at the evidence in front of her. The threats, the sabotage, it was all starting to take its toll, but then something in the back of her mind clicked. She couldn't afford to let fear dictate her next move. If she was going to take down this network, it wasn't just about exposing them. It was about showing them that she wasn't afraid to fight back. It was time to stop playing defense and start playing offense. The following week, Ava made her move. She arranged a covert meeting with a journalist who had been investigating the city's corruption for years, and they began discussing how to expose the web of criminals running the show. It was a risky move, but Ava knew it was the only way. The media could amplify their message, could bring public scrutiny to the corrupt officials who thought they were above the law. But even as she made these plans, Ava knew that time was running out. The more she pushed forward, the more dangerous it would become. She couldn't fight this battle alone anymore. As the investigation deepened, so did the threats against Ava's life. Her phone rang constantly with anonymous callers, warning her to stop. But Ava stood firm. She would not back down, not now. Not ever. Her phone buzzed again, this time a message from Raymond. "We've got a big lead. Meet us at the warehouse on 5th Street. We need to go public with this." Ava's heart raced. It was time. The city felt different as Ava stood at the edge of the warehouse, staring up at the towering structure. The cold night air bit at her skin, but it wasn't the chill that made her shiver. It was the weight of what was coming. This wasn't just another investigation, another round of paperwork or interviews. This was the moment where everything came together, where her fight, her sacrifices, her pain would either destroy or change everything. Raymond and James stood by her side, their expressions grim. They knew this wasn't just about exposing corruption anymore. It was about survival. They had all seen the threats grow worse, the danger intensify, but they had no choice but to keep pushing forward. The fight was too important. "Ready?" Raymond asked, his voice steady, though there was an edge to it. Ava nodded. "Let's end this." The journalist they had been working with had secured footage of Sheriff Lawson and Deputy Mayor Thorne in a meeting with known criminals. Deals were being made, bribes were exchanged. It was damning evidence, the kind that would bring the entire system down. They entered the warehouse cautiously, every step echoing through the empty space. Ava's heart pounded in her chest, not just from the adrenaline, but from the sheer weight of what they were about to do. If they succeeded, they would finally dismantle the system that had protected those corrupt officials for years. If they failed, there was no telling what would happen to them. They were playing with fire. Ava turned to James. "You're sure the journalist is in position?" James nodded. "He's set. All we have to do is walk in, and the rest is up to the press." They had agreed on a simple plan: walk in, confront the criminals, and let the press release the footage. There was no turning back now. But just as they neared the center of the warehouse, they heard voices. Low, muffled, and unmistakable, Ava motioned for everyone to stay quiet. Her eyes narrowed, and she scanned the shadows. Then she saw them, figures, stepping out from behind crates, their faces barely visible in the dim light. There was no doubt in her mind now. Lawson and Thorne were here, and they weren't alone. "Shit," Raymond muttered. "This is a setup." Ava's pulse quickened. Her mind raced, but she kept her cool. "We need to move now." Before they could make a move, a voice rang out from the darkness. "You really thought you could take us down?" Sheriff Lawson's voice was cold, mocking. He stepped forward, a sneer curling on his lips. "You've made a mess of things, Ava. You think we didn't see this coming?" Ava's breath hitched, but she stood her ground. "This ends tonight, Lawson. You and Thorne, your entire network is finished. We have the evidence." Thorne stepped into the light next to Lawson, his face twisted in anger. "You think you've won? This is just the beginning. You'll never be able to stop what's already been set in motion." Ava's hands clenched into fists. "You're wrong, it's over, we have you, and this time there's no getting out of it." A tense silence fell between them, and then gunshots. Ava's heart skipped a beat. The sound was deafening in the warehouse. Instinctively, she ducked behind cover, pulling Raymond and James with her. The chaos erupted all around them. Figures moved in the shadows, and Ava realized they were surrounded. The corrupt network had planned for this moment, and now they were trying to make sure it was the last one. "Stay low," Raymond shouted. The gunfire intensified. Ava's mind raced, her instincts on high alert. They had to get out of here, and fast. But as she looked around, she knew they couldn't leave without the evidence. The footage had to be secured. It was their only shot at bringing this down. "James, the footage!" Ava shouted over the chaos. "Get it now!" James nodded and bolted across the warehouse floor, weaving through the crates and debris. Ava and Raymond covered him as best as they could, their hearts pounding in their chests. The sound of gunfire was deafening, but through it all, Ava's focus never wavered. She couldn't let them win, not after everything they had fought for. Seconds felt like hours. James reached the makeshift command center where the journalist was hiding, and without hesitation, He grabbed the hard drive containing the footage. "Got tea?" "Hit!" James yelled, relief flooding his voice. But as he turned to run back, a figure emerged from the shadows, blocking his path. It was one of the thugs from Lawson and Thorne's network, armed and dangerous. "No!" Ava shouted. Without thinking, she rushed forward, adrenaline surging through her. She tackled the man to the ground, knocking the gun out of his hand. Her body crashed into his, but she kept fighting, refusing to back down. Every instinct screamed at her to survive, to keep pushing forward. Raymond and James reached her just in time, pulling the thug off her. James grabbed the gun and pointed it at the man. "Stay down," he growled. Ava stood, brushing herself off, her heart still racing. "Let's go," she said through gritted teeth. The three of them rushed out of the warehouse, the sound of sirens blaring in the distance. The footage was safe. The press would get it. The world would know the truth. Ava knew there would be repercussions. The fight wasn't over yet. But as they reached the safety of their car, something inside her began to shift. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. It wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. She had done that. The fight would go on, but Ava Moretti had finally reclaimed her power. In the days that followed, the press broke the story. The footage was out, and the fallout was immediate. Sheriff Lawson and Deputy Mayor Thorne were arrested. Corruption at the highest levels was exposed. The city, once a battleground, was beginning to heal. Ava stood outside the courthouse, watching as the perpetrators were led away in handcuffs. The fight wasn't over, but the first battle had been won. She had done what she had set out to do. She had made sure that justice, no matter how long it took, had finally been served. Ava took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past months finally lift. As the last of the corrupt officials were led away, she turned to face her team, Raymond, James, and Officer Rinaldi, who had all been by her side every step of the way. "We did it," Raymond said, his voice full of relief. Ava nodded. "Yeah, we did." But she knew the journey wasn't over. There was always more to be done, but now at least she could rest. She had won, and that was enough, for now.